I think this is very, very important because when we're talking about IRR, DCF, NPV, you left out, but I'm sure you wouldn't if you did it again, strategic options. We're all looking for not just analytics, but just to rephrase.
What if we don't?
Exactly right. Rationalizations on these things.
Yeah.
The point that I want to make in connecting this to pharma and connecting this to healthcare, you look at the digital industries, the old IT, the new digital industries are not so new anymore. And one of the things is clearly a completely different philosophy of openness, design for interoperability, et cetera. That's sort of there's another aspect which is sort of obvious. We sort of talked about it before this, but I want to stress it. Costs for doing things, building a chip is expensive, but the cost of doing machine learning, when I look at the cost and the time taken to run simple operations on Fortran, just to date myself, relative to what I can do now with a Python or TensorFlow, when we're not talking 10 or 100, we're talking tens of 6 orders of magnitude improvement. The thing that I find striking is that in the same way businesses move towards things that have big profit margins, and IT people move towards more computational power, I am struck by what I would infer or interpret as the lagging nature of the pharma and healthcare industry to take advantage of those increasingly more powerful, lower cost tools to manage the risk, to reduce the uncertainty associated with all the costs of molecule design, testing, managing the relationship with the channel, the partner, whatever. I'm struck by that because when I look, you mentioned Amazon and 5-6 years ago, Amazon was a retail organization. Literally 6 years later, $12 billion of their business is by leveraging the infrastructure they developed to support their retail business. Geez, I mean, who runs on we talk about Netflix. Netflix runs on AWS. It runs on the cloud. I wonder, what instead of outsourcing operations to the cloud, I would be really curious to know if I went to Pfizer and Merck and Genentech and Roche and all of these organizations, what portion of their design stuff and innovation and business, J&J, what portion of their stuff is running on a cloud? What portion of the stuff is taking advantage of computational superpower to do that stuff? I don't hear as much that we have Novartis.
Let me put one point in that if
I
might. So maybe more than you'd imagine.
Sure.
But certainly insufficient. But the extraordinarily under tapped into experience in data set is what happens from the time our approved products enter into the world, right? What we'll call real world evidence is the thing that will change everything, right?
Yep.
That's where we have to find a way.
That's both an opportunity and an Achilles heel for you
It's
right now.
unbelievable.
Okay.
What we will be able to do when we wind.
Is that a cultural issue, or an organizational
It's
issue?
just a moment in time.
Yeah.
It's all sweeping that way very quickly. There's a privacy component that one has to take very, very seriously. But those trends are on track and on their way. And when we have that,
you have to use a more postmodern thing than train.
It's the industry we come from, right? We're still on tracks. But anyway, that coupled to the world that we have imagined or you've imagined and abstracted in Netflix and other kinds of things can start to become somewhat close to true, right? That, in my mind, is the beginning of having, at the level of an individual, the evidence of the kinds of things that can allow us to then abstract back to a
Does your board understand this?
They do.
So absolutely, and I think the collaborations with companies like Google, for example, who are right in that middleware, being able to have that ability to not only understand what's happening in the real world in that data collection, which we call now in the big buzzword, big data and the analytics. There's a tremendous amount of collaboration that's ongoing within pharma. Yeah. So it's not that we understand this particular space as well, but we actually are reaching out to the people who actually understand this space much better, who can help us. So we still are trying to figure out what our core competencies and what we really do well.
Is data governance now a part of J&J?
Well,
for innovation?
Yeah, so I would call it data governance, but what the conversation shifts towards we've used in the past words like biomarkers, where you're going to have a biomarker associated with any project to be able to, inform how things are going to flow over time. That notion of having a pre-plan, right? A notion that's going to lead you all the way from the very earliest moments of beginning to try to talk someone into funding your project. I like this target. I want to try to make a molecule. I'm going to, over time, learn how it might work in an animal model, and over time, try it in humans, and then I'm going to try to get lucky enough to be able to sort out amongst the many people who get it, which are the few that are probably the ones who are going to benefit the most from it. That's always been thought to be informable by a very clearly thought through biomarker kind of co-development effort. But that's maybe the thing that helps you guide along the way. Now, the conversation shifts towards having a total data management kind of approach. Right, so you're moving along, not knowing where the data will be. It's certainly not as simple as one little validated test that might have been what you started with. But there are going to be tremendous things that you will have to, at moments along the way, engage beyond the physician into the lives of the individual who have it. And they will be part of the decision.
Do you know
do
what
they want
really
it?
help the startups is if the pharma could come together, and maybe you've already done this and I'm not aware, but could you all come to agreement on what RWE is?
Well,
That would be extremely helpful for those of us who want to start contributing that into this.
To collect it in.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think in answer to your question, there were certain cultures that had to be broken down.
Okay.
All right, so you have scientists coming out of the academy, right, and they're postdocs. It's my idea, my experiment, my paper, right, and whatnot. And so you have the laboratory notebook. So back in 2001, when I'm starting a company, we say we're going to all electronic laboratory notebooks.
That's a revolution.
They are available to everyone. I can read your preliminary results, and we're going to have ways of describing things so it's searchable, so I can learn from you. You had to break down that culture.
Right.
To the point about the cloud, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the chief information officers at the time saying, these are our secrets. We can't possibly risk it. And someone points out, so you've got two guys securing these things. Do you think Amazon could do a better job? And so now I know we're totally out on the cloud. All right, absolutely. Okay. Your point, there are more and more of what's called pre-competitive initiatives, all right, to try to come up with, it's less important now that we have natural language semantic kinds of search algorithms and learning, but it used to be, could we come up with canonical nomenclature? Because it's horrible, right? The EMR, the electronic medical record, sounds great, but it wasn't searchable, right? It was just, and also the whole question of, for this to be meaningful, particularly to do a biological interrogation or a genomic interrogation, you have to have consistent phenotype or clinical characterization. Otherwise, the noise in the system just blows it out of the water.
Right.
Okay. So, and again, I don't know if you're going to change physicians' way of describing things, and you may just have to come up with machine learning and natural language semantic kinds of approaches, and will overcome their handwriting. But it's going there. It is going there. Okay, so.
I just want to just a quick point of that, because I like your biomarker example. When I was in school, you had a data set. We did data mining. Now you use a data set to train. I'm sorry. That really is you literally couldn't do it even 5 years ago because there was nothing you could do it. You would have to go to the supercomputer center in San Diego or Champaign Urbana. Now, literally any schmuck postdoc is doing humongous, terabyte processing on that. And I think that is, honestly, that's kind of my view of why it's difficult for organizations like Pharma, that there are these assets that they're used to exploiting, literally mining and figuratively mining in a certain way, and the cultural, operational, and organizational shift to say, no, we're going to get more value if you use it to train instead of mine them.
Yeah, so I think that actually does separate the way that some companies behave. I think some of them have that curiosity that what they're doing is about learning. I think some of them have the idea that what they're doing is about teaching and telling, and I think that does differentiate companies like, say, J&J, which are pre-planning like the Alzheimer's work, which is we're going to watch what people with Parkinson's disease do as they move,
exactly,
and because we might learn something, versus trying to sell more product to them. But I'm,
Well,
I'm very
one
aware.
thing that just to keep an eye
Please.
on, if I might, just because I think you'll find this fascinating, is that it's not only what we can do with our data, but what others can do with it. right?
Absolutely.
So you're getting that out.
So you have
all-
APIs for those data sets
well, it's
now?
all, yeah, well, no, it's we're working towards that, right? You know, this stuff
Who
is-
owns that? Is it IT or you? Is it the innovation group or the
Well,
IT
not
group?
us. Yeah, I'm an investment team, right? We just build a portfolio of lots of things on the outside
Okay.
that could eventually be interesting to us and build a culture, a community around all of that. But the piece that I wanted to sort of bring up here as it relates to, you know, how do you get more people thinking about the problem with you, is to make your data available, right?
Yes.
And they'll soon have it because it'll be their data. They'll have paid for the product, they'll have collected the data themselves, and they'll be asking their own questions, whether they're informed enough or not, and coming up with what they think are the right answers. We have to run ahead of that, you know, that curve. So with, in this case, Yale, we've created an online repository for all the data associated with every product we have. So every bit of data that's ever been generated is available for asking. Now, we want to know what you're going to be doing with it, so we can make sure that the right kinds of things get done, but it's not by us that those decisions are made. They're made by a community of experts who can make sure that the right kinds of
Except for
things...
the Yale part, that sounds like a great idea.
Well, you know, they're
Said the
they're
Harvard
good.
man.
But anyway, my
MIT.
point is that
yeah.
it's
Undergrad?
also about the release of the content, right? You need to make certain that it's available for analysis and totally
But just to be
unanticipated
clear,
ways.
right, this is still at an infancy stage
That's right.
because honestly, we haven't even touched the benefits of what large and big data analytics could give us. So, to be honest, in terms of which patients would respond to therapy better than right at the very start, designing your phase 2 trials in such a way that it's smaller, more targeted, we're just starting to scratch that surface. And on the other hand, in the business side of things, in terms of actually who are our customers, how do they use it? You go to a BMW product manager and he'll regale you over a beer as to who their exact customer is, which bars he hangs out in, what magazines he reads, what's the age of this. You ask a typical product manager in a pharmaceutical company and say, what is your typical patient? And it becomes a half an hour thesis. And you say, how do you not know who your typical patient is?
There you go.
Right? And so we're starting to really leverage those kinds of things. And in pharmaceuticals, in terms of marketing, having been on the commercial side, I mean, honestly, we have still the mass manufacturing and segmentation that Ford company used, and we're far from where Amazon and Google has taken the market to individual, customized solutions, right? So we're far from it. We still make a pill, and that pill is the best for anybody and everybody who has hypercholesterolemia.
Right. And it's also the case that the BMW buyer is the driver, the Amazon book reader is the person who reads
the
the
exact
book,
consumer, correct,
and the patient,
Yeah.
all right, is not directly, doesn't pay for it. A third party does, and a prescriber
Correct,
prescribes
and that's
it.
what Bob was
And
saying,
so-
which is
right.
we are in a very funny world when it comes to commercialization and the business model, right? You actually don't see your end consumer. And the greatest thing in one of the lectures that I went to is he asked you, who's your customer, right? In healthcare, this becomes a funny kind of answer. So a customer is defined as somebody who uses your product and somebody who pays for it. It's very simple in every other business line, except when it comes to healthcare.
Right.
So you say, well, the doctor is the customer. And he goes, actually, the doctor didn't use the product and did not pay for it. So I don't understand. I went to a business school, and that's how customers are defined.
It's like a magic
it's
trick.
the hospital, because well, the hospital actually gave the service but had no say in the service and didn't pay for it. It's the insurance company. So you have this weird dynamic in healthcare.
And there's
when
the
we can't
PBM
define-
who's negotiating.
Exactly.
So this is far, so ecosystems and platforms that we're
Exactly.
talking about is far more complex
That's why
when it
you
starts
guys are
to
so
think about
ripe
healthcare.
for disruption.
I do want to
Exactly.
point out, going way back in this discussion about how economical it is to actually fund thought, right? Going to the Fortran example and saying
Right.
it was 6 orders of magnitude more expensive, and now we can do things like this.
And slower, too.
And slower, and we can now, you can use AWS, you can use Azure, small teams can compete with big teams. If
Right.
you have an idea, you can test
Right.
it out. That is fundamentally not true in our industry, right? If you are a PhD out of an area and you want to test out your drug theory, you have to have hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. You have to have access to a facility where you own the thought, and after all of that, you,
You
have
think
to have
that's
the
going to be
resources.
true in 3 years?
No, and I think that
There
look,
we
we could talk about computational
In 3
biology
years?
till we're blue in the mouth, right, and blue in the face. But the reality is that the pace at which that is improving the way we do R&D synthetic biology, the mean time for an experiment to go on, what it was 20 months,
That's
is
key.
now 5 months.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. The cost hasn't gone down. Adjusted for the rate of inflation, the cost of bringing a drug to market has gone up year over year in the last 50 years. And let me continue.
Yeah, sorry.
The requirements to bring a drug to market from a regulatory, safety,
That's right.
when we look at what is a safe lab to work out of, 20 years ago is different than what it is today.
Right.
We have higher standards, environmental standards. We have higher standards for what, here's where 5 tests we used to do before bringing a drug to market. Here are now the plethora of different things you have to go through
It's not
in order
a bug,
to
it's a
move.
feature because it's a barrier of entry then.
Yeah, but that doesn't work in drugs that you give people, right? It's not a feature. It's safety. Now we know what to test for. There's 100 tests you have to do. Preclinical, PK/PD, toxicology, multiple animal models you have to go through. It is more expensive today to make a drug than it was 30 years ago, and for good reason. To make it safer and more managed so that people do not die.
So here's my Gedanken experiment for you. If Facebook comes up with Facebook Med, where you post, Facebook comes up with a machine readable, where if you want to, you do the 23andMe or Ancestry.com sort of thing, the buccal swab, you put your connect and share. They figured out a reasonably clever way of anonymizing and aggregating, but basically 20% of everybody on Facebook, their medical records and phenotypic expression is there.
That's next year.
Okay, if that's next year, I'm asking this question out of complete ignorance. Well, my brother works at Facebook, so I have some insight as to whether it's next year or not. But were that to happen, would that have a marginal, significant, or transformative impact?
Marginal.
There you go. Okay.
Marginal, as opposed to
Okay.
Kaiser or Geisinger.
Okay.
Okay, having very, very, very detailed,
Okay.
consistent, longitudinal
Okay.
clinical information that I then couple with my, call it genomic analyses.
Fantastic.
All right,
But
that's
aren't medical
very
records just for reimbursement?
What?
Medical records miss probably 90% of what's going on
but
with the
what you're
patient,
seeing
right?
with Kaisers and Geisingers is they're understanding this, and so you'll see collaborations, Geisinger with Regeneron, for example, and Kaiser
But what's
with...
that? But what additional data are you actually getting from the patient with a Regeneron coming in?
No, Regeneron is doing the genomic and genetic analysis.
My
Right.
point is, what are you learning from the patient other than that? Because you have a sequencer that you can pull it out of.
I'm not saying that the genomic analysis is the clinical characterization. The question is, how comprehensive is the clinical characterization? How consistent is it? Okay, and to what extent is it longitudinally maintained?
He was topping my Gedanken experiment. His data set. Which is fine.
So, Steve, one of the things that we have to recognize is how we fundamentally have some sacred cows in the pharma industry. For example, randomized, double-blind, placebo controls are the best in terms of actually coming to a conclusive statement.
Are
about
they?
Helping.
What about adaptive trials where we?
Or
Well,
single
so
patient
what
trials.
we're
Basically,
talking about
design
more is the
still-
Kaiser longitudinal. It's in the marketplace. The methodology hasn't been agreed. There's confounding variables in here. So to jump to conclusions about, and that's the complexity of what we're dealing with. And the other thing I would say is, in many of the things we were talking about codes, our industry, to Amrit's point, is vastly different is because I can change a line of code and change the end product very quickly, and I can iterate a Facebook version. For me, in drugs, if I make a mistake, it's like snake and ladder's game. I go back to the starting point.
Right.
It's literally like the dice you rolled, and you say, you go back to phase 1 or preclinical.
Hold on.
I can't change, I can't go
Hold
to
on.
phase 3.
Here's my pushback to you. I buy the first part of what you say. Here's where I'm going to push back on the second part. Coming up with a global mobile device, an iPhone, an Android, a Moto, with silicon chips, with RF, LSI, that's every bit as capital intensive, precision oriented, it has to connect to a network, etc. And there are regulatory issues associated with their conflict management. So I don't quite understand, although I accept the safety and other things, I don't quite understand why the Apples and Huaweis and Samsungs of the world can, and Motorola's of the world can pull off these kinds of capital-intensive things.
regulation.
So, no, I don't think it's regulation. I come back
Go
to
ahead.
where I started is these are fundamentally engineering challenges as
I
opposed
agree.
to
You don't have
fundamental
biology.
science.
Right.
So if you look at a Samsung and Samsung says, I'm going to get into pharmaceuticals.
Right.
Where does it start? Biosimilars.
Right.
No innovation it's purely engineering. We know how to run big plants. We know how to do process control. We know how to do capital intensive stuff. I'm going to sink a bunch of concrete and steel at $1 billion or $2 billion.
Right.
We can do this.
Right.
You say to them, do drug discovery? They say,
whole-
that's
whole
totally
Even
different.
if it was just iterative,
They
on-
will 50 years from now
That's
as
right.
it becomes more.
Once you understand, yeah.
And I don't think it's 50 years, but sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm just going to riff on the same thing. It is the single change, even if it's the slightest improvement, the regulatory paradigm requires it all to start over, right? I mean, that is the world we live in today. Now that
Will the regulate, so what you're saying, my cheap inference from what you're saying is the surest way to transform innovation is to make some sort of fundamental change
No,
in regulation.
I disagree with that because
I
you
don't
have to recognize.
No, that's my inference.
If
You can disagree with my inference.
So,
That is my
so
inference.
think about this.
Yeah.
I take this molecule,
Yeah,
right? I change a hydrogen to a hydroxyl.
Right.
All right. I take the orientation of the hydrogen from this position to this position,
Right.
and I can turn important medicine into a poison.
of course.
All right. So the whole idea of iterating, improvement,
Right.
that next, it's in the nature of it. You have to go back to the beginning. You can reformulate. That's a different thing. Or make
prove
it,
it,
right. You don't have to. But so that
And
so
you're
there-
stuck with that information as well from a safety and a regulatory standpoint.
Right.
So
And an
you've
IP,
started a
too.
conversation that is a no-win, and regulators are designed not for efficacy, but to make sure it's like in the Hippocrates, like do no harm. Like if I'm going to put a chemical inside a human body, I better make sure that it is for the number one job. It has to be safe.